Now we're going to call for the lecture Dorothy Oja from the USA. Her lecture topic is the purpose of the relationship.
First, I want to say namaste. I am so happy to be here in this heartfelt country. I really feel it in my heart. Okay. All right, let's start. So my name is Dorothy Oja, and I'm going to be speaking about why we're together, or the purpose of the relationship, and how we might be able to see that in the chart. So I just want to start off by saying that this symbol here is not gender specific. It's simply meant to indicate union, or the spark that we feel when we want to connect with someone. That's all. All right. Let's see. All right. So for this lecture, I'll be using the Davison relationship chart, which is one of the combined charts that are used in astrology. And by combined, I mean putting two individual charts together to create that third chart, which is really the representation of the dynamics or the energetic dynamics of any relationship. The Davison chart in some computer programs is also called the time-space chart. And so briefly, just briefly, the Davison chart takes the midpoint of the two birth dates, the midpoint of the two birth times, and the midpoint of the latitude and longitude of birth. So what's unique about that chart is that the result is the kind of chart that astrologers are always used to looking at. Okay? It's no different than a natal chart because it has a birth time, it has a birth date, and it has a birthplace. So the uniqueness is that you can do anything with a Davison chart that you would do with a natal chart, including progressions, solar returns, lunar returns, solar arcs, everything. Okay. So clients will sometimes ask you, what's the purpose of my relationship? And most of the time they might ask about a past relationship. I wonder why was I in that relationship? What was that all about? You know, now it's not all clients who want to explore this way, because when we're talking about the purpose of something or the purpose of a relationship, we're really going deeper into something. It means we really want to go deeper. You know, we don't want to just stay on the surface. Well, we're together because we have chemistry, right? Of course. I mean, that's what it is, right? We really like each other. Okay, yes, of course. That's the first step. But it's no coincidence. There's no coincidence in the people that we meet. And especially no coincidence in the people that we really get close to. There is a purpose, there is something else going on. And some of your clients will want to go to that level and others won't want to go there. Oops. Okay, I'm going to do this one first. Astrologers, of course, may differ on what to look for in the chart for the purpose of a relationship. No surprise there, right? Astrologers differ all the time about techniques, about interpretation. You know, and we certainly have some consensus, but there is a lot of disagreement. So just bear with me and explore with me, and you can make judgments for yourself as you use this technique later on to see if it speaks to you. Not all techniques or ideas will speak to you in the same way, obviously. So some might look at the sun or the nodes of the moon. Certainly the nodes of the moon are important. I mean, they're typically, we understand them, or they're defined as karmic purpose. So that's another possibility. There are many different answers to this question of why are we together and what's the purpose of the relationship. And as we examine the chart for that, we will quickly be led to other parts of the chart anyway until we finally have the whole, because everything really is connected to everything else. We can isolate to look at things, and we have to isolate, but we eventually have to always bring it back into its wholeness. So it's Saturn that I'm going to be using to help us look at what the purpose of the relationship is. Now, there are some things we can agree upon, whether we're Eastern-oriented or Western-oriented in our astrology. We know that Saturn is a vital and important part of the chart. In traditional astrology, of course, Saturn was the end. It was the boundary of the known planetary system. So it still retains that sense of importance, that sense of a kind of a dividing line, kind of a line in the sand, a boundary. It still has that. It's also often called the Lord of Karma, right? Or if you don't like the word karma for some reason, we could say the Lord of Consequences, right? The consequences of experience, of actions. We could also say the Lord of Time, of course, that Saturn is typically known for that, of development. I mean, there's Saturn cycles of development, age 7, age 14, age 21, age 28, and we go on, and we have those assessments every 7 or so years in the Saturn cycle that we're all aware of, and that is the underpinning of modern psychology, even though some psychologists don't even know about it. It's also accountability, it's integrity, it's commitment, and it's the discipline required for success and the challenges that you will meet on your way to success. Now, no matter where your Saturn is, when we're looking for purpose, no matter that we're looking at Saturn, we already know that Saturn will not come easily. You're not going to instantaneously achieve that purpose, whatever that purpose is. Yes, for some it will be easier, but Saturn always requires the work. It always requires more of a challenge. All right, so this quote, I found this quote and I thought it was perfect for my lecture here. It's by someone that you might know, Stephen Covey. Probably his most famous book is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And this quote goes like this: "Trust is the glue of life. It's the most essential ingredient in effective communication. It's the foundational principle that holds all relationships." I often say, when I'm doing synastry or other kinds of relationship work, that Saturn represents the glue. It's what holds you together. It's your history. It's your commitment. You know, and if you don't have enough strong Saturn, then it may not be a long-term relationship, if you even want a long-term relationship. So I say, if you want a long-term relationship, you know, you look to Saturn and make sure that you're developing your Saturn. So this quote reaffirmed my sense that Saturn in the relationship chart is one key place to look for the purpose of the relationship, because Saturn is trust. It's one of the key attributes. Now remember, whenever astrologers give a talk or a presentation, there's only so much that we can say, and there's always so much else to be said. There are always more definitions, always more attributes. There's always more that we can elaborate on. So there's so much more to Saturn than what we've already described. So Saturn, if we say that Saturn represents trust, then trust can lead to commitment, and then that can lead to purpose. And when we are committed, we are willing to do the work that's required, right? Typically that's how it goes. We have intention or purpose. If we decide to commit to something, then we must also give it time. There's no commitment without time. So if you say you're committed to something but you're not willing to devote the time, then you really don't have a commitment. All right, so trust enables us to meet the challenges and the obstacles that must be overcome to achieve mastery, to reach the goal, to express the purpose. And trust does take time and builds over time. So sometimes even when we look at Saturn in the chart, it may not really have manifested itself. Sometimes it takes time, but it varies. We can say only so much that is basic. As soon as we say something basic about anything in astrology, or it immediately starts evolving and getting modified by sign, by house position, by rulership of a house, by even the number. You know, we've had many lectures about mathematics, and every single number has a different sound, a different significance. So there are many layers. Okay, so, and also, remember, I'm not just talking here about love relationships or romantic relationships. I'm talking about parents and children. You can do this. You can do it for your best friend. You can do it for your boss, co-workers. So, you know, this is not exclusive to love relationships. Okay. So another way to think about it is, what is the work that we've come together to do? That's another way to say, what's the purpose of of this relationship? What have we come together to achieve? What mission is required of us, and the energetic combination that we represent that is seen astrologically in that Davison relationship chart, which I call it the chart of the relationship, or the birthday of the relationship. That's what I call the Davison chart, because it is like a birth chart, as I said before. It looks exactly like a birth chart because it has all the components that a birth chart has. So it's the birthday of the relationship. No matter when you met or whatever, that combined chart is the birthday of the relationship. Just a little aside, a lot of times that actual birth date is significant in the life of couples. Not always, because nothing is 100%, but I've seen it enough times to be able to say that the date can be an important part of the history of that relationship. So for some couples, purpose is clear, and for others it is more subtle, or as I said, it merges over time. But Saturn in the relationship chart is the key to stated purpose, and sometimes, of course, it's unconscious purpose, because, again, as I said earlier, not everyone is interested in that level of depth of wanting to understand that. It's not pejorative or it's not a value judgment. Some people just are not interested at that level, that's all. It's not important to them. All right, so once we locate Saturn in the Davison chart, we need to do a few things, as we do with most other conditions in the chart. Assess its sign, element, dignity, cardinal, fixed, mutable, all of that. Its house position, its house rulership, its aspects. And, you know, we need to do that in order to understand the entire picture. So you can't just go in and say, okay, our Saturn is in Aries, you know, and stop there. Our mutual Saturn in our relationship is in Aries. No, that's not enough. You have to keep going layer by layer by layer and peeling away to get to the subtleties of all of that. Okay, so for instance, with Saturn in Aries, you know, besides everything else I've said, you also want to see what Mars is doing, the dispositor of Aries. So peeling away the layers. So our assessment will also lead us to the house, as I said, that Saturn rules in the relationship chart, but also going back to fundamentals, Saturn rules the 10th house. So even though there may not be a relationship to the 10th house when you're looking in the relationship chart for Saturn's position, there's always a relationship to the 10th house with Saturn, because it's the natural ruler of the 10th house. And that goes for all other planets as well. All right, one of the most striking examples of a Davison relationship chart that I've encountered for many reasons, not only for my discussion today, is the one between John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. You know, it's, you'll see as we look at it, but I'm going to give you the data first. So John F. Kennedy Jr. Was born on 11/25/1960, 12:22 a.m., Washington, D.C., a rating of A, which means it's from a birth certificate, which always makes us happy when we have that as astrologers. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was born on 1/7/1966, 8:45 a.m., White Plains, New York, rating A, also from a birth certificate. Before I show you the chart, I also want to say that in my normal work with couples, the relationship chart is the last chart that I use, okay? You have to first understand the individual charts and what each individual chart says about their needs and their capacity for relationship. Each chart has needs and capacities that they bring to the table and that they want to get. So that's the first piece of work, and then you do the double wheels, the synastry, one chart around the other and vice versa, and then the last one is the Davison chart. But we're doing something very specific today. We're looking for the purpose of the relationship, and so we're skipping all of that for this lecture, and we're going to be looking for Saturn in this chart. All right. So I'm putting this up here, and I'm going to tell you the story so you can just get a sense of them and what happened to them, and then we'll go into the Saturn. Some of you know the story, but John F. Kennedy Jr., of course, was the son of JFK, who was an assassinated president of the United States. He was the only surviving son, and you know, he comes from a very tragic family. The Kennedys were just one tragedy after another, and this, of course, was the latest. So these two died in a small plane crash off the coast of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. They were going to a wedding, actually. Her sister was also in the plane. So the three of them crashed into the ocean. John F. Kennedy Jr. Hadn't had a lot of experience flying, not enough to go out, you know, against the advice of of the airport, which said the weather was bad. Well, not really bad, but not good enough for someone of his level of experience. And what they think happened was that he got disoriented in fog, and he just couldn't see the horizon, couldn't see where he was going, and they crashed. So it was a very sad situation. You can kind of, I guess I don't have a light on here, but just look at the top, you know, with Mars, with the Pluto, Mars, Uranus. I mean, it's all right there. Okay, but we're not going to dwell on that because it's actually going to bring us around to everything anyway. So let's look at Saturn. Yeah, I don't have a light, I guess. Whoops. Okay, great. Okay. Oh, all right. So Saturn is down there in the 3rd house in Aquarius, and it's retrograde. All right. So it's strong in Aquarius because it's in its traditional, one of its traditional signs, right? But it's retrograde. So without being in any way pejorative, because I don't think we should ever be pejorative about any position, we just have to be pragmatic. And what I would say about a Saturn retrograde would be that the potential of that energy would be a little bit harder to access, okay? That's how I would put it with a retrograde. But Saturn is strong. It's strong in its own sign. So they did have strength of position, okay? They definitely had strength of position. We could give them that. I mean, they certainly had no problems with money. They were well known in the 3rd house. Saturn is in its own house because Capricorn is on the cusp of the 3rd. But there's another effect here, is that Saturn is intercepted. We're using Placidus here. So we have an intercepted Saturn, but it's in its own house. It's also disposits the south node. All right, so those are some things already. So Saturn is in an air sign. It's in an air house. It's in a fixed sign. All right, so all of that gives us information just right there. You know, so I would start saying things like, you know, certainly communication. You know, issues around communication or the truth of communication, or feeling bound by certain ways of having to communicate, or propriety and so forth. So there was a desire to kind of get free, or to be able to maybe speak more freely, to be more of a person rather than an icon, maybe to be more who they were rather than who they were expected to be. So, you know, there was a struggle there with that. The dignity, we can see the dignity again when we see that the Saturn is trine the Sun. So again, there's some kind of a dignity there in that it was, the status came easily, notoriety came easily. They were gossiped about. They were constantly hounded and photographed. So, you know, there wasn't a freedom of movement in terms of air at all. If we see the trine to the Sun in Gemini, that's ruled by Mercury, which brings us back to the 3rd house again, and Mercury. We also see that Saturn is square the ascendant in Scorpio, and Scorpio is ruled by Mars, and Mars is in Virgo, ruled by Mercury again. So everything is bringing us back. And the Sun ruled by Mercury, and we see that Mercury's in Gemini, in domicile. Everything is bringing us back to Mercury or the 3rd house. So their purpose definitely had to do with communication. So here's a little recap. Okay, so in case I didn't say all of this, they had a unique societal position. I think I did mention that. Okay, so I said that potential may take longer to realize or understand consciously. You know, they knew they had a struggle. They probably felt trapped in some ways, trapped in their position, trapped in an identity that was kind of imposed on them. But, you know, Saturn in Aquarius is, I also like to think of that or other planets in Aquarius as kind of wanting to make ripples in time. I'm sorry? Oh my goodness. Really? Are you sure? Okay. Oh, that's too bad. All right, let's go on. I think I've said most of what's on this sheet. So, so let's just recap. We could say that these two were unusual couple, celebrities with privileges, but everything was fodder for gossip. All right, I'm going to go on. I added this at the last minute. I added Melania Trump and Donald Trump. All we have is so here's something that I do that I think will work. If you have a birth time for one and not a birth time for another, what I do is I reduce both charts to 12 noon Aries rising, because it's going to give you a lot of really good information, but you just have to remember the moon is not going to be exact, and you don't have the houses, the natural house. You don't have the houses that they would have if we had her time, but you have the natural houses, which, as I said earlier, you have to consider anyway. So it's going back to the pure form of the pure form of where those planets would be. Pure meaning. All right, so this is their birth chart, their relationship chart. So I didn't plan that both of these would have Saturn retrograde. It just happened that way. So there's Saturn retrograde up there in the 9th house. Now, in Sagittarius, are we surprised? No. So the task is to find meaning, to find wisdom, and with the opposition to the moon in Gemini is to find a way to speak that has meaning, find a way to communicate or to educate or to advance, you know, with wisdom. But it's obviously not easy to get. Now, another reason it's not easy to get because Saturn is in the 12th house of its own cycle. In other words, it's in the sign right before the sign that it rules. So that is also a little bit of a detriment for that Saturn in Sagittarius. This is a very complex chart in that it has a grand fire trine, and with so Saturn trine Venus, Venus trine Pluto, Pluto trine Saturn. But Venus is also debilitated in Aries. But we can also see how the grand trine definitely works in that, you know, financially, Saturn, Pluto, and, you know, and making its mark, making his mark or their mark, you know, in a very fiery, kind of bombastic, very visible, very active kind of way. There's also a T-square with the moon. The moon, 17, Pisces in the 12th, square Saturn, square the moon. And even though we don't have the time, the degree of the moon exact, there's still a relationship between signs that are opposite each other, even if they're not totally in orb, so that it does work. So we have that T-square. Whenever I see a T-square, I immediately look for the phantom leg, the 4th leg, so because that's where a lot of action will operate. That's where there's a natural desire to balance, and that will be in Virgo in the 6th house. So being specific, using words specifically, clearly, accurately is the dynamic that wants to happen. That's what wants to happen, and that's also where the criticism is going to come from, you know, because that is the missing leg that creates the whole pattern in the chart. So precision certainly is not there. So words matter, ideas, philosophy, information. We also see the confusion with the Mars and Pisces. So I think it's always really good to do a zero Aries rising, because you can really, capture the essence of the planet and the sign that we sometimes miss when we just see it in a time chart, and we see it in different places. So in a sense, it's really going back to basics again, really going back to the essence. Mars and Pisces in the 12th house, 12th house energy of Mars and Pisces that we might miss otherwise. Okay, I didn't hear any bells. Is there one? Okay. Okay. All right, so I think I said this, yeah. All right, so the highest manifestation of Saturn and Sagittarius would be the search for wisdom or inspiration, or being able to expand in a fiery, generous way to help others expand, or to inspire people. To give, to be generous, rather than to try to amass for your own personal wealth all the time. The lowest manifestations are exaggeration, opportunism, and untruths, or enlargement, expansion for your own purposes. So I think with all that we've described in terms of the patterns with Saturn, this is a very complex purpose and a little bit harder to achieve than some. But with Saturn, you have to work. There's just no way out of it. You have to work with Saturn. Another question you might want to ask, well, how urgent is the purpose? How imperative is it? And there are different ways that you can find that, by the quality, dignity, the types of aspects. And the most important thing that I want to end with is that there is never a guarantee that the purpose of the relationship will be achieved. There isn't. Because if you don't want to work it, then, and even if you do work it, it's hard to achieve your full potential. We try, we want that, but it means that we have to work. We have to really work to do that, and that's what Saturn always asks of us. So I thank you, and I hope that this will interest you and have you searching and in these charts to see what you will find in your relationships. Thank you very much.